False identification. An essential subject from Vinipedia. The living entity has this tendency of falling down by dint of misidentifying himself as fully independent to lord it over the material world. The root cause of all troubles is therein false egotism. When a living entity forgets the constitutional nature of his relationship with God, he is at once overwhelmed by the external energy. This is the cause of his false ego, his false identification of the body with the self. There are some philosophers who say one should give up his ego, but one cannot give up his ego, because ego means identity. One ought, of course, to give up the false identification with the body. Srila Prabhupada's books, lectures, conversations and letters offer a comprehensive presentation of this essential subject as seen in the Vinikote's false identification category. An introduction from his books is given below in the following 9 quotes. Quotes from Srila Prabhupada's books. The symptoms of the self-realized person are given herein. The first symptom is that he is not illusioned by the false identification of the body with his true self. He knows perfectly well that he is not this body, but is the fragmental portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Bhagavad Gita 13.8-12. By taking advantage of the guidance of Super Self in the form of intelligence, we can either continue to study and to put into practice our conclusion that I am not this body, or we can choose to remain in the false material identification, fancying ourselves to be the possessors and doers. Our freedom consists in orienting our desire either toward the ignorant, material misconception or the true, spiritual conception. Armad Bh Gavatam 2.2. 35. Kama and Labha are the symptoms of material existence. Everyone always desires to possess something. It is said here that desire and greed are the products of false identification of oneself with the body. When one becomes free from this contamination, then his mind and consciousness also become freed and attain their original state. Armad Bh Gavatam 3.25. 16. Instead of accepting a temporary occupational duty based on the material body, one should take to the process of Santana Dharma or Bhakti Yoga, so that he can put an end to this perpetual bondage in material bodies and return home, back to Godhead. As long as human society works on the basis of false material identification, all the so-called advancements of science and philosophy are simply useless. They only serve to mislead human society. And Yathandharapanyaman, SB 7.5. 31. In the material world, the blind simply led the blind. Armad Bh Gavatam 4.28. 61. False identification with material nature is the cause of false ownership of things which are offered by the arrangement of superior control. All material resources are offered to the living entity for his peaceful living and for the discharge of the duties of self-realization in conditioned life. But due to false identification, the conditioned soul becomes entrapped by the sense of false ownership of the property of the Supreme Lord. Armad Bh Gavatam 3.12. 2. The conditioned souls are not originally fools, but by the influence of the avdi function of material nature they are made fools, and thus they are unable to utilize knowledge in the proper channel. By the influence of darkness, the conditioned soul forgets his relationship with the Supreme Lord and is overwhelmed by attachment, hatred, pride, ignorance and false identification, the 5 kinds of illusion that cause material bondage. Armad Bh Gavatam 3.10. 17. When one is fixed in the understanding that he is part and parcel of the Supreme Soul and that his eternal position is to serve in association with the Supreme Lord, he becomes self-realized. This position of rightly understanding oneself cuts the knot of material attraction, H. Diagranthi. Due to false ego, or false identification of oneself with the body and the material world, one is entrapped by MY, but as soon as one understands that he is qualitatively the same substance as the Supreme Lord because he belongs to the same category of spirit soul, and that his perpetual position is to serve, one attains Tmadharanam and H. Diagranthi, self-realization. Armad Bh Gavatam 3.26. 2. When a living entity forgets the constitutional nature of his relationship with God, he is at once overwhelmed by the external energy. This is the cause of his false ego, his false identification of the body with the self. Indeed, his whole conception of the material universe arises from this false identification with the body, for he becomes attached to the body and its byproducts. To escape this entanglement, he has only to perform his duty and to surrender unto the Supreme Lord with intelligence and devotion and with sincere Krishna consciousness. Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, Chapter 4. Akara said, My dear Lord, due to my false identification, I have accepted as permanent everything which is non-permanent, such as this material body, which is not spiritual and is the source of all kinds of miserable conditions. Being bewildered by such concepts of life, I am always absorbed in thoughts of duality, and I have forgotten you, who are the reservoir of all transcendental pleasure. I am bereft of your transcendental association, being just like a foolish creature who leaves a water spot covered by water-nourished vegetation and goes in search of water in the desert. Krishna Book, Chapter 40.